Good evening, everyone, to our community that's in person and to those who are viewing online. I'd like to call this work session to order. Ms. Soyer?
Present.
Davis. Jones. Here. Dr. Roberts. Present.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Dr. Adams, we can move into presentation.
Good afternoon to the board and to the public as well. We have two representatives here from the retirement board, and I ask that they will come forward to the podium, introduce themselves, and then they will start with a PowerPoint presentation. At the request of the board president, I was asked to have them come, and I'm really overjoyed that they were able to accommodate the schedule to make it, to give the board an update. You received the PowerPoint presentation. There was one additional document I think that they brought as well that we need to distribute that they were able to bring today. And so we'll pass that out to the board as well, but you're welcome to come to the podium, introduce yourself, and then move from there. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you all very much for inviting us to be here today. So we are passing out copies of the PowerPoint along with a couple of additional handouts that we'll go through today. My name is Susan Kane, and I am the Executive Director for the Public School Retirement System here in the city of St. Louis. And I wanted to introduce a couple of other folks that are with us here today. We have our Board of Trustees Chairman, Mr. Lewis Cross, who's here as well. And then a couple of gentlemen that have been working with us on some items that we'll go through here in just a little bit to talk about from HeartNet. Reyes, we have Matt Gearsey and Jim Fall here as well. So again, thank you all very much for giving us the opportunity to come and talk about the system, a little bit about our background, a little bit about our history, and then also some challenges that we are currently facing going forward. So to get started, just a little bit of a background. The public school retirement system of the city of St. Louis, so we abbreviate ourselves because that's a lot to say. So we abbreviate ourselves PSRS STL. So we were created by the Missouri State Legislature back in 1944. And again, we operate under state statute. Our mission is to provide pension and retirement benefits to employees that work for St. Louis Public Schools, as well as charter schools here in the city of St. Louis. So those regular employees can be teachers, they can be nurses, they can be counselors, secretaries, groundskeepers. We cover every regular employee that works for, again, St. Louis Public Schools and also the charter schools that operate here in the city of St. Louis. We have over 12,000 members right now. That breaks down to 4,944 who are active members, and those active members are actually working and contributing to the system. We have 4,334 retired members. Those are individuals that are currently drawing a monthly retirement benefit. So they can be an active member that has since retired, drawing that benefit, or they can be a survivor of an active member. And then finally, we have about 3,500 inactive members. And so those inactive members are going to be folks that maybe are vested, eligible to receive a benefit in the future, but have not reached that point yet, but have left employment. And then individuals who had contributions in the system that they have not yet requested to have refunded to them. Our current funded ratio is at 73.56%. And that funded ratio we'll talk a little bit more about today, but that funded ratio is going to reflect our ability to cover not only our current but future liabilities. And that is determined by our actuary every year. He does a valuation for us, and looks at all the obligations and comes up with that number based on a lot of different factors. So some challenges that are facing the system going forward, our active membership has been declining. Since 2000, we had over 6,000 members. And as I mentioned earlier, we have less than 5,000 members in 2021. The funded ratio, again, which is a very important measure for a retirement system, that has largely remained pretty flat. So going back to 2017, we were at 73.7% funded ratio. We're at 73.56% today. So again, pretty flat. The funded ratio, again, relies a lot upon what contributions are coming into the system. So that's something that we're going to have to look at. Again, over the last few years, there have been some challenges. So let's take a look at kind of what happened back in 2017. So in 2017, the Missouri State Legislature did pass a bill that both reduced the amount of contributions coming into the system as well as increased member benefits. It was kind of a double effect on the system. So what that broke down to is in 2018, the employer contributions into the system were capped at 16%. So again, typically what would happen is the actuary would determine each year, would determine the amount of funding that was required, again, looking at all of our liabilities and a lot of different factors. So the actuary would make that calculation of what employers should be contributing into the system. So starting in 2018, that number was capped at 16%. And then each year going forward was going to be then reduced by 0.5% until it gets down to 9% in 2032. So that's the employer contribution. So these rates, again, typically this portion, 16%, and the decline is well less than what the actuary would typically recommend be contributed to the system. It can be as high as 20% that the actuary would recommend, but typically around anywhere from 15 to 19%. So in addition to this change in the contribution, we also saw a change, an increase in member benefits. So members were typically eligible to retire under the rule of 85, and that was lowered to the rule of 80. So rule of 80, what that means is when your age and years of service equal 80, then you're able to retire with full benefits. So this means that an individual is able to retire earlier and pay into the system less, and then probably will draw benefits longer. So that was an impact on the system as well. Now, the member contributions were also impacted in this legislation. So the member contributions were previously were at 5% prior to this 2018. And so what was introduced then was each year the member contributions were going to increase by 0.5% until they cap out at 9%, which again will happen in 2025. So any new person coming into the system would immediately start paying at the 9% starting in 2018. So that is an increase, and that's helpful. But at the same time, members who leave the system are able to take those contributions with them. And we typically process about $4 to $5 million a year in contribution refunds. So all of this decrease in the contribution puts pressure on the system. We still have to meet those obligations. So it helps us, we have to rely more on our investments to make that happen, which, as you know, can be challenging when you have a global pandemic and you have a global conflict along with a global pandemic. So certainly all those things are challenging for investment. So what we've been working on are some possibilities for how we can introduce some new legislation. Again, this is just the start of the proposal. It's just the beginning of where a conversation that we want to have about the system. Again, so some suggestions that we have put together, or proposal, is based upon something that was passed previously by the state legislature for the Kansas City public school retirement system. So on the other side of the state, there's an organization very similar to PSRS STL. It's Kansas City. So back in 2013, they were impacted, a very similar type of legislation, got down to 9% on both employer and employee contribution. So eventually legislation was passed to assist in their funding as well. So what we're doing is modeled on that, but again, it's the start of a conversation, and we would like to begin that process in the 2023 legislative session. The goal of this proposal is to stabilize, the funding for the system. And also there's a pathway there to increase or decrease rather the employer contributions into the system as well. So really want to see it as a win-win for all parties involved, because we understand, how expensive it is, how much it costs to contribute to the retirement system. We know that's a large line item on your budget. But at the same time, the retirement benefit can be one of the most effective tools to recruit and retain staff. So what we're proposing is beginning in 2023 is having that employer contribution rate capped at the 14%. So again, that was scheduled to kind of decrease 0.5% each year. So we're at the 14% now. So we're just recommending that starting in 2023, that remain at the 14% level. And then 2024 and thereafter, it would depend on the funded ratio for the system. So if the funded ratio is less than 100%, then we're going to see that it's going to be the greater of the 14%. Or a difference between what the actuary is recommending, which again, we get that calculation every year, and the 9% employee contribution rate. We also have embedded in the proposal that there would not be more than a 1% increase in the employer contribution. So if there was some major issue where funding was needed, again, it's just a 1% swing. And I have some charts that we'll see in just a minute that kind of gives you an idea of how that's all going to play out in the future. So if the funding ratio would happen to exceed 100%, then we would look at what is the actuary recommending. If that is exceeding 18%, then that employer contribution rate would be the difference between, again, what the actuary is recommending and that 9% employee rate. And if we have another scenario where, again, the funded ratio is above 100%, but less, the employee or the actuary contribution rate is less than 18%, then again, you're going to see an equal split between the employee and the employer. So again, we've got some examples of what that's going to look like here in just a moment that I'll show you. We're not proposing any changes for the members, either in what they are receiving in benefit, that rule of 80. We have seen a lot of people use the rule of 80, so that would remain in this proposal. So again, what our goal is to have stability for our system, and also a path for the employers to see their contribution rates go down. Again, we know how expensive it is to contribute to the system. As I mentioned earlier, what we also have included in there, limit increases of employer contributions to just 1% a year if necessary. Eventually, this model would give us a path to 100% funding. And we would then be in a position to be in very strong financial shape to meet those obligations, not only for current retirees, but for the new teacher walking in the door. There also could be the possibility to look at a cost of living adjustment for current retirees, certainly not part of why we're doing this, but it is a possibility once we get closer to that 100% funding. It's been since 2006 that the retirees have seen a cost of living adjustment. So would be opportunity for us to look at that. So this chart, and again, I know there's a lot of numbers on there and I know they're small, but what this chart does is it gives you an idea what some of these things would look like going forward. This was produced by our actuary. So what we have in the presentation, but you have actually the information in front of you as well. But what we have here is a couple of different scenarios. So this first scenario, scenario number 3, is with the recommendations that we have in place. And this is if we were to achieve our expected investment return, which is set at 7%. So if we were to achieve our 7% return, so what I want to call your attention to is that third line down where it says normal, the entry age normal funded ratio. If you kind of follow that along from 2022 to 2036, you can see that, based on the recommendations that we went over and the fact that we've met our investment return of 7%, you can see the funded ratio get stronger and stronger each year until eventually we do hit that 100% target. If you look down a little bit further where it says employee contribution rates, you will see there that again, what's in place. You will see that, current going forward, what that is, all the way 9% until you get to 2036. And when you get to 2036, then you see that amount actually reduces. So again, we have built in, once we get to 100% funding, then we're going to see some relief for employees and also the employers. So when you go to the next section, then again, you'll see, what that statutory rate is. So it's 14% all the way across. And when you get to 2034 or 2036 rather, you'll see that that is also a pretty significant decrease, from the 14% employer contribution rate to less than 8%. So again, that just gives you an idea that if we can go forward with this, there's going to be, good outcome for the system, a good outcome for employees, and a good outcome for the Board of Education as well. The next scenario looks at same recommendations, but if we do not, if the system does not meet our actual returns. So what was built in here is if the system has a 5.5% investment return for 10 years, and then we do finally meet the 7% after that. So what you can see here is if you go back down to that third line, the entry age normal funded ratio, if you follow that all the way through, you'll see again, the position of the system does strengthen, but we don't quite get to that 100% mark. The employee contribution rate, again, you can see that that remains stable, constant at 9%. And in this scenario, the employer contribution rates are also 14% until you get into the 2030 years. And then it does gradually increase, so it's around 15% or a little bit more than that. Again, that's typically what would have been recommended by the actuary, probably even a little less, because again, we've seen it as high as 19 or 20%. So while it might be a little less than what is being paid now, it is certainly less than, what was paid previously. The next two pages are really just kind of graphical representations of what kind of all of this looks like with the contribution rates in place. So if you see, we have a solid pink line, solid blue line. So the solid pink line is what the actuary would recommend. The solid blue line is what our current situation is of contributions. So you can see there's a pretty large gap between that solid pink line and that solid blue line. If you go to the dotted pink and the dotted blue lines, you'll see that that is, what we're recommending. But again, you still have the actuary is going to come every year and going to tell us what should be contributed by the employers. So we're still going to get that analysis. But if you look at what that solid pink line is versus the dotted pink line versus the dotted blue line, you can see that they're much closer together. So that gives a little more strength, to the system. And then the next page, again, similar scenario. Again, assuming we meet our target, and it's looking at we meet our target, or if we don't meet our target under both the current and the proposed scenarios. So again, you can see where the solid blue line versus the solid pink line. That's looking at current situation that we have now, and they're pretty far apart. And then our dotted blue and our dotted pink line, again, a little better situation for the system here. And then the last kind of page in there with a lot of numbers is really just skipping forward to 2036. So you can kind of see a summary of what's taken place and what's happened here. If you look at this would be the last year and what we had projected in that prior chart, those two scenarios. You can see, scenarios 1 and 2 are our current situation. So where we are right now with that declining employer contribution rate. So again, if we have a good investment year, then we may turn out to be fairly okay. In scenario 2, obviously that funding ratio pretty flat, pretty much where we are today. But scenario 3 and scenario 4 give a little more strength to the retirement system. And then scenario 3 actually gives relief to the employees for contribution and the Board of Education and other employers for their contribution as well. So, less even than projected under the current scenario, the current legislature that we have. So that's just a snapshot giving you a little bit more detail of what's involved there. So again, as I mentioned, this is just what we hope the start of a conversation with the Board of Education and our other stakeholders. These are preliminary suggestions that we are looking at today. We're not here to ask for anything specific. We're excited to be here to talk about this, but we're not asking for any kind of specific commitment today from the trustee or from the Board of Education. We do have a lot of work to do in talking with our stakeholders and working with the legislators in the state of Missouri, which again, we will take on that task. But we wanted to start the conversation, explain what our thoughts are and what it is that we're planning to do, what we're hoping to do. So again, thank you all very much for allowing me and our team to be here today, and be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Does the board have any questions?
I'd like to thank Ms. Kane and the team for coming before the board. You've given us a lot of information and food for thought, but we receive it and look forward to next steps.
Okay.
So I do have a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first question is, what is considered well-funded, and has the fund ever been at 100%?
I think briefly were many years ago. Typically for the state of Missouri, 80% is
Correct.
kind of a threshold to be well funded. If you dip below 70%, then you go on a watch list with the Joint Committee on a Public Employee Retirement System here in the state of Missouri. So we're kind of close to that right now. But we would like to be as close to 100% as possible. I mean, that's obviously the ideal number.
So as I looked at the data in your annual report, it indicates that a percentage of persons are leaving every year. It seems that that percentage is higher in charter schools than they are in the St. Louis Public School District. Is that a consistent statement that you would find? within the first 5 years?
Yeah, what I would say is with charter schools, a lot of times individuals there move from one charter school to another. So they may work at one school for a year or two, and then they go to another charter school within the city of St. Louis. So they are still an active member. So they may leave, but then they may come back and, still be a participant in the system.
Okay, your annual report indicates it a little bit different than that. So we'll be interested in having a further conversation regarding that. The other question I would ask is, obviously, those individuals who become contractors as opposed to employees have an impact on your on the amount of money that's contributed as well. Has there been any analysis done relative to that as it relates to, i.e. the district or charter schools as well, in light of the most recent article that came out regarding a charter school?
Yeah, we actually are working on that right now and are going to be expanding our audit capabilities. So right now, every year we do, work with St. Louis Public Schools as well as a chosen number of charter schools to, audit their payroll information. So we have begun discussions with our audit firm to expand that into a more comprehensive audit. All charter schools do agree to a comprehensive payroll audit when they agree, when they sign on as a member. So yes, we are going to be expanding that.
Talk to me a little bit about investments in terms of, you indicated that 7% would be ideal. When is the last time that the fund has been at 7%?
So we actually have had years where we hit 7%. 7% is the target that is set by our actuary. So that is a set of assumptions, and that was actually just approved by our board last year. Previous to that, it was 7.5%. And then 5 years before that, it was 8%. So it's a little bit harder in the current environment to hit those targets. So those were decreased. In 2020, our investment return was about 9%. And then we've had years where we're in the negative as well. So I'd say over the last 5 years, we've probably averaged right at 7%, but that means we've had some years where it's been very high and some years where it's very negative. So it's balanced out.
So the previous legislation that you alluded to, obviously that was done, I guess, in 2017. Prior to that, there was not a cap on the district's contribution. Am I correct? In other words, that could be 25, 30%. And so this legislation tried to put a cap on that legislation. In your new analysis or your new proposal, are you looking to have some kind of cap for the employer such that the district is not responsible for $40 million, $50 million a year relative to the contribution?
Yeah. So again, this would have that, 1 year, it could only increase by 1%. And again, based on us meeting our investment targets, then, the Board of Education is going to end up paying less, at some point in the future, but is going to end up paying less. So our goal in our proposal is to try and not only bring stability to the retirement system, but also to find some relief for employers, because again, we understand how expensive that can be.
Last question for me. Has there been any thought relative to some consolidation of the retirement entity with the state retirement system as it relates to this retirement system being part of that? That's the first part of it. And the second part, any conversation relative to any kind of 401ks moving forward? Obviously, legislation would have to be put in place for that as well. So just wonder if there's been any conversation at the board level relative to those two issues in light of the fact that pensions are just becoming so much more difficult to maintain.
Yeah, so that, again, we are created by Missouri state statute. So any movement to combine, there's 3 systems right now. Any movement to combine those would be, state legislature driven. And I'm not aware of any of those, conversations that are happening. We offer a defined benefit plan, which is obviously, a great deal for the employees, but expensive for the employers to maintain. So again, no conversations that I'm aware of changing that particular structure and system, it would be, a big undertaking
Right.
to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So just to follow up on that, speaking about legislation, are you working at all with our lobbyist or our legislative committee or Local 420 to get some of this legislation done? Is that a collaborative effort right now, or are there connections that we can help you with?
Yeah, certainly. And I don't know if Jim, you want to comment at all on but we have been working somewhat on all of that.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Jim Fall. I'm an attorney with Hartnett Reyes Jones. And as part of this legislation, obviously, this is just start of a discussion. Have been in discussions with 420 and have presented and tried to reach out to some of the other stakeholders, being the charters and you all here. And that's part of this. The idea is that no legislation, our hope is that no legislation would be filed until 420, ourselves, the school board, and the charters have something that we can all agree on and all live with to the extent as possible. We anticipate that to be a number, because of the way the legislature works, a number year plan. So that's why we're coming to you now to have that conversation. 420 is aware of the legislation, and there's been talks about that. My understanding, not to speak for them, is that in concept, they like the concept. Obviously, devil's in the details. And we're working through that right now. But I've been in contact with some of the representatives as well as some of their attorneys to try to come to something that they can agree to. They've seen the same thing that you're seeing here today, that hopefully you can agree to, and then hopefully the charters can come to as well. So we're at the preliminary stages, but nothing's going to be filed until everybody has had input and hopefully agree. And if that agree, then at least something that we can all live with.
Thank you. I just want to point out that we do have two outstanding members of our legislative committee on SLPS here, Mr. Matt Davis and Ms. Tony Cousins. So they're great resources if you need any input from them.
And Ms. Kane has reached out a couple of times for the legislative committee. I passed that on. My hope was that after we get through this session, at least this month, that we could go back and revisit it. And I mean, I think you're right. That'd be a good way to do it. And Byron from 420 is on that committee, and he mentioned at the last meeting as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Just want to say thank you again for coming. I know I called you a month ago and you were really timely in terms of responding. So I thank you very much for coming and providing some feedback to the community and the board as well.
Okay. And thank you all very much. I appreciate your feedback and your conversation tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Tonight is my intent to provide the board with an update regarding the CPN. This will be a tag team effort with myself and Mr. Hartman. Obviously, he presented, I think, in October, and Madam President wanted me to come back before the board to give the board sufficient time prior to a vote possibly taking place at the next board meeting, and the work session was the obvious place to do that. And since I was initially responsible for the beginning of the CPN, I thought I would do the first 2.5 slides. Mr. Hartman would do the next 4 or 5 slides, and then I'll move to the last 3 or 4 slides. Obviously, you're not taking a vote tonight. I have 2 big documents on my table for anyone who wants to dig deep into all of the weeds regarding it. For any board member who wants to have a copy of that, I'll provide that to you. But I have 2 hard copies tonight for any board member who might want to take the full scope of everything relative to the CP, and this is a synopsis of it. So in January 2019, after the district became fully accredited in 2017, I realized that there were still many schools that we were not able to address the academic needs of those schools. And so as a result of that, I started looking at what might happen if we looked at alternative ways of supporting schools, giving them the flexibility and autonomy that they needed to have. In addition to that, the state came and identified schools that would be comprehensive schools and targeted schools. So I started looking at, along with district, other additional leadership, to look at entities across the country that were really doing a good job regarding supporting schools that have been um, um, very difficult to increase academic achievement and stability. And so one of the entities that we looked at was the CPN that was in Springfield, Massachusetts. A number of parties, including the union, including other partners as well, the foundation and others, visited Springfield, Massachusetts. We spent a day and a half there, talked to all of the parties relative to what was happening in Springfield, Massachusetts, came back and started looking at some research around what was going on and how that might work in the St. Louis Public School District. We looked at a 501c3 that will be called the St. Louis Public School Consortium and registered them as a nonprofit, looking at that as a possibility of separating the notion of supporting schools in that kind of detailed kind of way. Again, this was really all about academic achievement and what could we do with those very difficult schools to move academically. Initially, the board was comprised of Dr. Priscilla Dowden White, and she's here tonight. Where is she? Right here, who's the president, or at least the chair, along with, because that was an automatic appointment as it relates to the SAB was obviously, as you know, one appointment by the mayor, one appointment by the alderman. And so we use that same format, doesn't have to be that format, but that was the format that was used at that point in time. So Dr. Dowden White, Marcus Robinson, who was a mayoral appointment, and that has been changed as of 30 or 45 days ago. The mayor has a new appointment now. That person is Vernon Mitchell, the Chief Equity Officer for the City of St. Louis. And then Mr. Sullivan, who was at that time the chair of the SAB, he was replaced. He's been replaced by this time by the president of the board, Dr. Roberts. Vivian Corbin, who's a parent, who will be moving off the CPN at the end of this year, and obviously myself as superintendent. So that was the makeup of the CPN. The district and the foundation started having conversations regarding what this might look like, and a partner came to the table and indicated they would provide some seed funding for what this might look like in terms of supporting schools. They thought it was a novel idea, thought it would be something to try to look differently at our schools. Again, this was all about academic achievement and what we could do to provide autonomy and flexibility to schools. So the board had some conversations with the union. The union president did attend the meeting with us in Springfield, had many conversations, but at some point in time, the union felt that they were not willing to come to the table around a firm MOU regarding the CPN, and Mr. Hartman is going to talk about what we've been able to do, even in spite of that. I've had multiple conversations with Mr. Cummings about it. Again, we looked at contract schools, we looked at pilot schools, all these things we looked at as ideas to create this autonomy and flexibility. Next slide, and I guess I'm talking more than the slides. In January 2019, we identified two schools, one in North St. Louis and one in South St. Louis. It was intentional that we looked at two schools on different sides of the city. All staff were offered an opportunity to remain in this particular initiative. Only one person from one of the schools, I think it was Ashland, indicated that they did not want to participate in this effort. We worked with the union around this and transferred their employee to somewhere else. All other employees said, hey, this is a great idea. It was really about teacher leadership. How do we build a team that can make decisions inside of the school that we would be honored, that we would honor and obviously implement in a way that would try to drive what would happen in that school. In other words, the decisions were closer to the students as opposed to central office making decisions, network superintendents making decisions. This teacher leadership team would make decisions, bring those recommendations to this quasi board with all items coming before the SAB at that time, but this board moving forward. So all items at the end of the day are approved by this particular board. Ashland and Merrimack, again, voted for their own leadership teams. Those teams began working on strategic plans with an outside partner. Those dollars for that outside partner in terms of project management was a group called Bellwether. And so dollars were covered to address the plans that those schools were coming up with. And those were the plans that we were looking to implement over the next 3 years. It is noted that both Ashland and Merrimack were already identified, as I said before, by the DESE as comprehensive schools, and so that categories are comprehensive and targeted. And so right now we have network superintendents that support these schools, with the exception of these two schools. And I think we have a total of about 17 schools that are comprehensive and targeted schools. So these two schools are separate and apart and managed by, or at least supported by Mr. Hartman as the outside entity supporting these schools. Everything about these schools indicate that they're still 100% a part of the school district. They're all employees out of the school district. Every single purchase is made through the school district's entities in every way, shape, or form. The outside dollars support Mr. Hartman's salaries and any other additional kinds of things that schools might want to have coming through coming through that venue. Each school presented their final strategic plans to the CPN board, and we approved those at that point in time, asked a great deal of questions. In the following year, spring of 2019, we advertised for someone to be the outside entity that would act as the partner with us, managing these schools, supporting these schools. And at that point in time, Mr. Hartman, as well as I think 6 or 7 other persons applied. The board interviewed those persons and selected Mr. Hartman as the person responsible for the leadership, if you will, of the support. Mr. Hartman's role is equivalent to our network superintendent's role. So they manage about 10 schools right now. He manages 2 schools at this point in time because these are targeted schools with a great deal of support that we are trying to focus on these schools to obviously change the needle around what happens in the schools. And he's going to talk in detail about what has happened over that 2.5 or 3 year period of time. Obviously, the pandemic has had an effect on the data district-wide, not just at these 2 schools. The last thing I'll say before I come back is Susan Jones was a representative appointed by Dorothy Rowe Collins as the district's representative for the CPN during her tenure. When she rolled off, obviously the president did as well, and serves on the CPN board at this point in time. So that gives you some background. Mr. Hartman wasn't part of the initial thoughts around the CPN. That was driven by the superintendent and administrative team 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And again, I want to repeat over and over again, this was about academic achievement. And these were schools that have been struggling historically. While the district received accreditation in 2017, we were proud of that. We still felt there was a subset of schools, and still do, that need additional support. If you think about the Sumner for the Ville group that came before this board a month ago, similar kind of concept. At this point in time, the other school is I can't even think of the name of it right now, but they have their own independent board that supports that school as well. CSMB, thank you, my brain is going. CSMB, similar kind of concept. An MOU is in place for the CSMB, and the board will be approving a MOU as well for the Ville group that's working with Sumner. We're still working on that document after going back and forth about some language that we wanted it and some things around that. So this is a repeat of what we've already done in a lot of different ways. The pilot schools, as I said before, in 2011-12, we tried 5 pilot schools. The challenge around that piece is it wasn't sustainable. As principals leave, as faculty leaves, it's not as sustainable as we believe that this to be when you have a support board that really kind of requires and mandates that some things take place on a regular basis. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hartman.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Good to see everyone again. Want to take a minute to recognize the CPN school staff that is here. If you guys could all just stand up really quick. We got Mr. Strong here from Merrimack, Ms. Preston, Ms. Easton, Ms. Stevens, and Ms. DeLeo. Thank you guys. And as Dr. Adams introduced, Dr. Dowden-White, our CPN president. So thank you. So one of the first things that CPN schools were able to do was adopt a new reading curriculum, and that was a big part of their flexibilities. That was a one-time approval by this board. So thank you for that. It is of note that within the next year, the entire district was exploring full ELA curriculum adoption as well. They began implementing those plans using that new reading curriculum in the fall of 2019. And a big highlight from that very first year of pre-pandemic was the flexible reading groups that they called reading hubs, especially at Ashland. And they were really, really successful in that first year. We did some more external fundraising in that first year in order to help continue to support innovation at schools. And in the winter of 2020, each school began to explore a relationship with WashU's Institute of School Partnership for Leadership Development. Dr. Adams mentioned the unique structure of the elected leadership teams. So they thought it was important to match their elected structure within the school with professional development that would really robustly train the teacher leaders to make those collective decisions. So that's an important highlight. And then in the spring of 2020, Merrimack and Ashland, of course, shifted to virtual instruction, as did the rest of the district. In the second year of we started in virtual instruction. Merrimack actually was the first school to return to in-person instruction and offered up their building as a place to learn around processes in order to make sure kids were safe. And that was a really good moment of them showing teacher leadership. They continued to progress in hybrid learning. Leadership team meetings and training became virtual. But they both of the teams took on a book study around place-based learning, and then eventually crafted an entire session, a week-long professional development over this past summer aligned to that. That was and we're able to use that extra funding to provide stipends for all staff who participated. In the last fall, we were able to hire a data strategist that has really helped us learn from some of the challenging data that we've seen, especially around student mobility. We continue to partner with an outside group called Instruction Partners to support with extra academic coaching. And we have also done additional fundraising to secure a 5-year commitment to support the ongoing work. And finally, last summer, we were able to also hire a academic and curriculum and instruction support that has really been instrumental in helping our math growth. So this year, a couple of highlights, and then I will summarize. We've seen a really significant growth in both reading and math. And by significant, I'm classifying that as more than half of a year, in half of a year at most grade levels. We have launched some of those innovative practices and created sustainable work around that. STEM Lab, proud of Mr. Ramos, the Teacher of the Year in elementary STEM from Merrimack. Teachers are really flexing their muscles around writing their own curriculum and place-based learning, doing it, of course, with a lot of robust training. And that has led to pretty significant shift in mindset around leadership roles. We obviously have done a lot of work around aligning materials to increase students' MAP readiness. We are positive about increased enrollment projection for both of our neighborhood schools, and we have ongoing supportive funds to support that innovation. And then we've also provided some direct support to the district's redesign fellowship this year too. So I'll stop with all the narrative and just a little bit of summary work. This is how our external dollars are spent. We do this in collaboration with the leadership team. So you can see that the majority of it is spent on professional development and coaching for staff. Some of the money goes directly to teachers for extra service pay for when they're spending time in that professional development. We obviously have a lot of data support, and then some of it is just going to buy extra materials for teachers and students when they are making these, slightly more autonomous decisions around curriculum. Some broad highlights of what this support is able to provide. We've got smaller coaching loads, which we think is very related to the positive academic results. We have been doing the place-based learning, talked to you through that. It's very teacher-led. And then the STEM lab is one that we are wanting to continue to highlight. We do have some strong comparative STAR growth. We've saw of the tested classrooms, of the tested grade levels, we saw significant growth in math in all of them. And then in 10 out of 12, we saw that in reading as well. We're seeing a slight decrease in mobility at one point in time this year. We think that in the last few weeks, it's probably continued to go back up. And then enrollment at Ashland is trending upwards for the first time in over 10 years. So that's something to note and track its progress. A couple things that I just want to note And like, I will tell an anecdotal story here too. This is a long list of things that are site-based decisions. That is really the bet here, is matching site-based decisions with support. And so when I first started 2.5 years ago, when the teacher leadership teams were getting together to decide things and create policies and procedures for their school, there was a sense of like we've never really been given this level of decision making before, so this is kind of tricky and clunky, and we're not sure what to ask for, and we don't want to ask for something and then be told no, because then we're less invested. The week before spring break, we saw both leadership teams together, people who are here in this room, setting goals, going into the next professional development cycle, planning out how they're going to implement those goals over the summer to launch next school year. And it was night and day difference between how they are seeing themselves as leaders and agents of change within their building. And there was no confusion or reluctance. It was like, we are getting into this and we are going, and get out of our way, please, and help advocate and fight, because that is like personally something that is very exciting to see, the people who are closest to kids making decisions about what's best, and then us having the privilege to try to support that and advocate for that. So this is a long list. I won't go into detail of all of them, but these are things that are being decided by teachers and at site-based, and that is a big bet of this initiative. And then finally, I will close with just reminding you that we are very intentional about learning from our data. We don't want to just give people autonomy and give site-based decision without really digging into it. And that's one of the reasons why we have invested time and money into having a data strategist, so that we can learn, so that we can push teachers to learn even more about their student data. And so we're looking for short and long-term insights into that. So I'm going to hand it over back to Dr. Adams. And thank you again for allowing me the time to be here tonight.
So in conclusion, the CPN is necessary from my perspective. Is that the right one? So the question is, what else is possible? Partner with the district and union on extended hours is one of the possibilities. Find ways to make stipends-based activities pensionable. Right now, they're not. So someone works as a stipend, they don't get a pension. That was one of the things that we have to negotiate with the union on. Create incentive structures for highly qualified teachers going to the highest need schools. The idea of how do we find ways to incentivize people to go to schools like Merrimack and Ashland. That's not the places that people come to work in the St. Louis Public School District. They're looking for somewhere else to go most of the time. More direct support for families at neighborhood schools. I think it's a moral imperative that we look at neighborhood schools in a different kind of way and support them. And this is a way that we see ourselves trying to do that. And also expand this notion of extending services for families in those communities, legal services, job training. Right now, Little Bit Foundation does a great job at Ashland, and also partners are coming to the table in ways that they have not come before, as they see the energy and the leadership teams coming in and working in these schools. Some of the current successes: supported funding and staff for neighborhood schools, as I indicated before, the rationale for current structure, elected and empowered and innovative leadership teams impacting what happens in these schools, and the rationale for future structure, benefits of learning from early adopters. In other words, can we look at this and replicate this in other schools, either with this model or a different kind of model? But the idea is that even through a pandemic, these schools have moved forward in a positive direction. I was really concerned that the pandemic would really have a negative impact on what was happening in these schools. But quite frankly, if these schools can do this kind of work in the pandemic, then I'm positive they can do it outside of a pandemic, understanding that we've been involved in a pandemic for almost 2 years, quite frankly, 2 years, March as a matter of fact. And these schools have struggled, obviously, like all schools, but they have, through their leadership teams, have taken some leadership and working together to try to change the environment of what happens even through the pandemic. And so I'm incredibly supportive of what they're doing and believe that this is something that this board and this district needs to continue to look at. As I listened to Mrs. Cousins last night at the the event at Riverview. And she talked about this notion of thinking outside of the box and the idea of looking at schools differently, because what happened in the 1900s in the early 2000 has to change because kids are in a different place. Well, I will say to you that staffs are in a different place as well, and they want greater ownership in terms of what happens in their schools as opposed to things happening to them. They want to be involved in the decision-making process as well. And that's why the staff behind me at Ashland and Merrimack really support this effort from everything that I've seen. So I'll stop at this point in time and take any kind of questions that the board might have, myself or Mr. Hartman. I am not asking the board to vote on it tonight. I am asking the board to come back in April to vote on it. I am available over the next 2 weeks for any kind of one-on-one with the board members, as well as providing you with this large document with everything in it for those who want to read everything that has happened over the last 3 years relative to these two schools.
I have questions, Dr. Adams. I'm trying to get clarity and understanding when I'm hearing the term autonomy, that the two schools have autonomy and the teachers and the administrators are able to make decisions as to what's best or what's the best practice for their schools. Just for clarification, so are we saying that the other schools don't have that?
So using the example that Mr. Hartman used,
Mhm.
they selected their own language arts curriculum.
Mhm.
All other schools could not do that. We selected a district curriculum called Savage that this board supported. I think the tune of it was over $1 million. And so no, all schools don't have the flexibility to make individual decisions around individual things like the curriculum that these schools did.
Okay, so with them being able to make decisions of that, they're able to make decisions in regards to that, and you're saying they don't basically fall up under a certain network superintendent, but at the same time, the district covers cost for these two schools.
Covers 100% of the cost, with the exception of Mr. Hartman's salary and the two support people that support him.
And the board does not have a say pretty much, I guess, in what the cost looks like or how things are done.
Define what you mean by that.
So I'm just trying to make sure I understand, which I don't have I question the autonomy aspect of things. I think all schools or all principals or whatever areas should have a say in regards to what the curriculum would look like, because I think that helps determine what the need is for that child at that particular school. Because one thing you stated that I said, we do need to reimagine how we're teaching and how we're educating. And to do that, you have to understand what this kid may need at this school, this particular area, that kid may not need the same thing at the other school. So I think all teachers or administrators should have that decision, but I'm trying to make sure I understand if the district is responsible for covering the cost of the operation of the schools.
Yes, ma'am.
But are you saying that the board don't have input of what goes on, so to speak, of the day-to-day activities of that particular school, of these two schools? Because one thing I heard that I found interesting is that Merrimack was the first to open during COVID. Was that because they're part of they're in autonomy and they had the ability to make that decision?
When we started having conversations about schools going back, they raised their hands and said, we want to be the first to look at that. Teacher leadership team came together and said, hey, we would love to get kids back. We know that in person is the best way for that to happen. And so they raised their hands as a school that said they wanted to be the first to look to do that.
And I'm just wanting to make sure, because with that being said, and them having the ability to do that is because they were part of the CPN and they were considered an autonomy.
Because the leadership team of that particular school,
They asked.
And they wanted to go back earlier than everybody else. I think we said it 2 weeks later. They said we're willing to go back now to start the slow movement of getting kids back in school. Our staff is willing, and parents are telling us they want kids back in school.
Okay, and you're saying that, so just make sure I understand. So the CPN, this particular pilot, so to speak, started kind of so in 2019.
2019 is when I brought the idea to the table.
And when did it actually start? Was it 20?
This is the third year, so it's 19, 20, 20, 21, 21, 22.
Okay, so compared to the 3 years that they've had the autonomy, the CPN has been in existence. Have we compared where it meets comparison to other schools that don't have it
Uh-oh.
and have their grades
Yeah.
increase? What is enrollment like? I heard a statement in regards to Ashland. People are now going, attendance has increased the way. I'm just trying to get my head around those.
So St. Louis University
Mhm.
is doing an analysis at this point in time, surveying staff of schools that are like the CPN schools, Ashland and Merrimack, and looking at data as well. We're still in a process of crunching those numbers,
Mhm.
but I don't have that data in front of me today because they're still in the process of doing it. The reality is we wanted to have that data much earlier because of the pandemic. It really had an impact on interviewing and looking at all of those kinds of things. Remember last year, we did not have any map data. At least 2 years ago, we did not have any map data. So we do have some comparative data. That documents that I have right there that has everything in it does have some preliminary data on all of those kinds of things.
So the data is basically showing, I'm just giving schools, tell me if I'm right in the comparison. So if we take Ashland School and compare it to Walbridge or Herzog School, and we see enrollment wise, academic wise, and I'm not necessarily speaking of MAP because I agree we didn't do
right,
MAP.
right.
I'm trying to see, do we see a major difference in enrollment, reading levels, math levels, things of that nature? Do we have that level of what you're saying with that data to show the comparison, to say this is why this CPN can have a huge impact and potentially spread to other schools
So we
as
do have,
opposed to what schools don't have? I'm sorry.
we looked at schools that was similar to Merrimack and Ashland.
Mhm.
And we started doing research around those schools, looking at the qualitative data and quantitative data and some qualitative data with interviews.
Mhm.
We're still in that process doing
Okay.
that. I can give you what we have now. The intent is that we're trying to finish it up by April, but we knew we had a 90-day window to bring something back before the
Okay.
board. But I want to be very clear here and transparent to everybody in the public. The pandemic has had a dramatic impact on all of the kind of data pieces that we look at. But we do have some comparative data that we can share with the board to let you look at apples and oranges, apples and apples against each other. So yes, we do.
Okay.
So as a point of clarity, I believe that am I remembering this correctly, that the Consortium Network Schools adopted a different reading curriculum
That is
2 to 3
correct.
years ago, the core knowledge, language arts.
That is correct.
And that was a vote that did have to come before the board.
That is correct.
So the board still has some autonomy and some say so and some accountability to the
The
public,
board
right?
really has
Everything.
all autonomy in terms of anything that's approved and not approved. That's fiscal. It still has to come before the board. The leadership board, if you want to call it that, advisory board made up of Dr. Roberts, myself, we're looking at that data on a regular basis. We look at the analysis. We have a meeting, what is it, once a month, once every 6 weeks, and we bring recommendations to this board. Having the superintendent at the table as well as the board president and all of these other partners gives them a closer support, if you will, to be able to analyze things, ask the critical questions, and then bring things before the board. So the board still has to approve everything. This board still has to approve everything.
Got it. Thank you. I just wanted to make that distinction that
Yes.
we don't have, teachers and principals out there writing checks, that
No,
everything does
no.
come through the board. And it
Everything
is
comes
still
before the
our
board.
responsibility to look over what's happening in these schools.
That is correct.
So your recommendation at this point is not to make any changes to the governance structure regarding the nonprofit and the nonprofit board.
So at this point in time, no, but I would take recommendations if the board sees that they want to do this. I am more concerned, quite frankly, Mr. Davis, with the initiative continuing. Am I willing to tweak some things? Of course. I have no qualms about doing that because I do think this is an initiative worth continuing to look at. Obviously, we don't have enough data, to Mrs. Cousins' point, that quantifies it needs to be here right now, and 10 other schools need to be a part of it. No, because we're still looking at the data. So I will welcome any recommendations that this board might have to tweak anything relative to the advisory pieces. But I do think the initiative is worth continuing.
Because we keep using the word autonomy. And I think when it was originally described, when the SAB created it, it was supposed to be autonomy from the SAB or the school board. But really what I hear you and Mr. Hartman saying is the success of the teacher leadership teams and the innovation is autonomy from 801, not the school board.
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it. I think it's really about the teacher leadership teams owning decisions that impact their school. If that means separating themselves from some of the recommendations at 801, okay, then that might be what it is. But in this particular case, it's really about empowering people in that building to make decisions. And yes, in some cases, you're going to find, I met with the persons regarding the redesign group today. The redesign group made up of 6 or 7 schools are interested in doing a similar kind of piece as they redesign their schools to walk away from some of the quote unquote dictates that we might have. One school wants to move from 7:30 to 8:30 a later time. One wants to move 6th grade to a high school because they have a small middle school as opposed to a number of 6th graders in their building. So yes, schools feel better and faculties feel better if they can make some decisions and believe that they can own some of the decisions in their building. They realize, Mr. Davis, that they can't walk away from everything. They just can't. We're talking about the pension. They can't walk away from the pension and do a 401k. They can't do that. But they do want some flexibilities. And they believe that more intimate leadership board gives them the ability to do that. That's the vehicle for them to do that with the superintendent at the table, the board president at the table, and any other partners at the table that can advocate for them and support them. So if you want to say separation from 801, I will acquiesce to that statement.
Well, I think what I heard, and I heard in reading this stuff before, and Mr. Hartman hit on it, and if you look at the WashU stuff where they talk about people and interview people that have participated in the program from the 2 schools, is, I guess, just culturally, and I don't know what this is, but culturally in the school district is the teachers and the principals, and I mean, I see this in my own schools all the time. They're scared to death to make autonomous decisions when they know it's the right thing. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's because the network superintendent is not a good fit. I don't know if it's the way they were trained. I don't know if it's human resources, but to me, that seems to be the underlying truth in all this, because I think this is great. I mean, I love to see the teachers who are the trained professionals who are there every day, working with their students, doing what they know how to do and feeling good about it. But that's not always the case. It's really not the case. And so I would love to give that autonomy within reason, obviously, because we do have, there are some things of scale that we need to do as a school district.
That's correct.
To provide value to the taxpayers.
That's correct.
But we also provide value to the taxpayers by letting the people that they employ do the best job that they possibly can do. So I just don't see us getting in the way of that. I just don't see it. And it seems like that might have been part of the vision when this was created. And that's why the governing structure is the way it is. But I would, if we continue it, and I'll be happy to meet with you and talk more about this. Because I mean, I'm not an education expert. I'm just a consumer, I guess. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, I guess. And it doesn't seem like just an advisory board. I mean, I get the collegiate thing. It's a lot of doctors and stuff like that. And they're coming in and some of that may just be, it looks good and people feel good about the people that are participating. They may provide real value. I don't know. But this being a separate nonprofit that was created by the district, but it's kind of separate from the district with the mayoral appointees and stuff like that. I think that probably needs to be a minimum revisited. But some of the other things on here that you talk about partnerships and stuff like that, it seems like you're getting towards the community school model that we're talking about. And if we're thinking outside the box and we're thinking big, I mean, let's do that. So I'm sorry, that's not really a question. This is a comment.
No. I think what you said makes a lot of sense. And again, I am not married to the structure of the 5 in the way that they are right now. Not at all. That was part of what was in place. I think what I am married to is the idea of allowing them to continue the work that they're doing in a strategic kind of way, because if this is a model that has some legs, we want to see what it looks like. I don't want to do 22 schools a day. I don't want to do 5 schools a day, but I do want to continue looking at these 2 schools minimally for the next 2 to 3 years, especially since we lost 2 years because of the pandemic. And then come back to the board at some point in time and say, hey, let's add 2 more schools. The state approved the notion of this idea with these schools being comprehensive schools because they are interested in how this might look across other districts in our region that are struggling. And so I have no problem at all, Mr. Davis, coming down and looking at the whole structure of this and tweaking some things if that's what will get the board to approve this.
So to add on to what Matt said and to lend some context, we were discussing, actually back when before the board was back in governance, we were discussing the structure of the board and we had some similar concerns. So I would like to revisit that as well, now that we're a governing board, and we've seen a little bit of what the CPN is able to do. Personally, my concern was not enough community involvement, too top heavy, a lot of the mayoral appointments and outside entities. So I think that we could really structure that to become more inclusive and more beneficial to the community.
I'd like to weigh in as well, because I believe in teachers and what they're doing in this process is working and they're excited about it. The CPN is a remake of school site-based management that we had in the district many, many years ago that worked, where a majority of the schools leaned in to teacher leadership and principal partnership. And so at the school level, it does work. Like our colleagues, I like to take a look at the governing structure, so it's much in line with what we're doing in terms of a citywide plan, so that it does give a feel of a community school environment, and that may be one of the strategies that we employ.
Can I ask, I'm sorry, Ms. Donna, can I ask, I'm trying to wrap my head around it. You said raising funds, you raised $400,000. Is it with the CPN, and because the nonprofit was created and engaging, it gives the school, these particular schools, the ability to be able to do basically additional resources or services that other schools wouldn't necessarily be able to do? Is it safe to say that's one of the things that they're able to do through that nonprofit?
Yes, ma'am.
And then my other question is, everything I've seen you guys present, and it made me trigger when Natalie made the statement that she made. How are you engaging in the community, like from which the school is in? Is there any collaboration? Is there any community type of events or things that these two schools are actually doing that's bringing the community in to be a part of the schools to help them excel?
That would be better coming from Mr. Strong, if I don't mind putting him on the spot.
Put them on the spot.
Come on, Mr. Strong.
They love Mr. Strong in Dutchtown. I know that.
So I'm sitting back just watching so what I will say when it comes to engaging the community, that is part of the, we'll say the life of the CPN, because Merrimack is a community-based school.
Mhm.
And I said that in all aspects, like our families are from the community, and the same thing, we deal with the problems and issues of the community. And I will say, going back pre-COVID, we were on a roll. We developed community-based meetings. And in those meetings, we had, right before COVID, we were right there putting like who's on first, who's on third. And when I say who is who, I mean, we had, before Tashara Jones was the president, we had the treasurer's office in there. Jared Boyd would come to the meetings they were starting to begin offering like financial literacy for our parents and families, and even for the teachers. Working with Karen Kalish and the Homeworks, I brought in Ameren and Spire to actually help our families free up utility debt. So that was coming in. Places where people were coming to offer like social work and counseling and therapy for our families, and even trying to get them to offer like the therapy and counseling for teachers as well, because we have that secondhand trauma. So the community was 100% involved in what we're doing to for the CPN, and to bring just Merrimack and Ashland just forward, because that social, emotional, and that community aspect is really what we need in and combined with the educational aspect.
So was that just specifically for Merrimack, or was that for Merrimack as well as Ashland? The same activities and community engagements that was going on in Merrimack, was that being done at Ashland as well? Do you know? Everything
In certain aspects, I don't want to step on Dr. Bodie's feet or anything,
Mhm.
but everything that's offered for one is offered for both. Like Merrimack and Ashland, we're brother and sister schools. So what comes in one door is always welcome and open in another door.
Oh, that's all right. Yes, I guess my concern is the 5-year commitment that's being asked of the board to support the CPN. And if you're asking 2 and 3 additional years for these types of schools, then I think that courtesy should be extended to all St. Louis public schools because of the pandemic, since all have suffered due to these conditions. And I guess I'm really concerned because these schools do receive additional funds. They're able to have a data strategist, which is a very good thing. And I have witnessed many people, teachers, administrators, who are very afraid to speak their mind about what's going on within the schools. We have lost almost 75% of our African-American teaching staff, Black and brown people. And now it's separate. Our school body is almost 75% African-American, and the Black and brown teachers are gone. So that means that we have not been listening. So I'm just trying to understand. I understand we have two schools, the CPN, and it was my understanding of being on the board so long that this was an alternative to having an elected board, not what has been spoken here tonight. People are saying a lot of things, but I was sitting at the table and the CPN was created as an option to have an elected board. And that's what I saw. And that's just the truth. And so I'm really hoping that all the things that have been extended to the CPN will be extended to all SLPS schools, and that our teachers will have the ability to make decisions, they will be respected, and that the same amount of money that we've been extending to the CPN be extended to all SLPS schools, just like a Herzog, just like a Nance, just like all the other schools here. So that's just my feeling on it. I'm just really disappointed that to hear our leadership say that they're not able to handle some of our struggling schools. What's going on here? I just really want to know what's going on. Thank you.
Ed, Ms. Jones, this is a 3-year extension. It's not a 5-year. It ends in June 2022, so we'll be extending it to 2025, which will be 3 years.
Is the ask because of COVID? No, I'm saying you're asking for the extension because of the challenge with COVID, like right in the midst of starting. Okay. Okay.
Not because of COVID, because it ends on officially
Okay.
June 2022. And so it's asking for 3 more years as an extension,
To
not
the-
5 years, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
I would like to recommend to my colleagues that we have an opportunity to meet together in preparation for the upcoming ask that we extend the CPN.
That's all I have for tonight, Madam President. I think the board has some items that they have, plus the consent agenda.
Let's move to the consent agenda. Are there any questions? I did have a few that I submitted earlier to the superintendent and he responded. I hope that you all did receive copies of those questions and his responses, but if there are any additional questions, now's the time. Okay, hearing.
Madam,
Dr. Adams.
yeah, we do have one item that I'm asking the board to approve tonight, which is at the top of the agenda, which is 329-2201. And it was listed for vote tonight as well.
This the one with the correction?
Yes,
On the
ma'am.
date.
Yes, ma'am.
I'll make a motion to approve 329-2201.
Second.
Ms. Sonier,
Yes.
Ms. Cousins.
Yes.
Ms. Fowle,
Yes.
Mr. Davis.
Yes.
Ms. Jones. Dr. Roberts.
Yes.
Motion passed.
Just to follow up on my ask about our coming together to further the discussion around CPN, I will ask that Ms. Williams send out a doodle poll to each member so that we can come together and discuss in further detail. I'm sorry, Ms. Cousins.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. First, I want to thank the team that stood up last meeting and presented in regards to the state of the citywide plan and the things that were done. Especially Matt, who kind of took over for me, who punished me and had me take over for him last night. But things have really been progressing in regards to the citywide plan. And to my understanding, the acts was that we come back to kind of go a little deeper into the work groups and how things stood in regards to the work groups. I will say that we have been very busy. The document that I sent before you is basically kind of defining the work groups from which we had discussed before, but going more deeper into the work groups where the guiding questions will be asked as part of the work groups, and the key questions will support those guided questions. Understand that the work groups and the 5 terms or groups that we've come up with, again, was not something that was done based on the board per se, but it was based on a study that was done when the district unfortunately had to close the 7 schools down. And we actually had someone come in and have community groups asking what they would reimagine St. Louis Public Schools, or what they would reimagine education to be for the city of St. Louis. And this is where the deep dive came, and we were able to come up with these 5 groups at this time. Please understand, these groups can definitely grow even bigger, but this is a starting point of where we are and what we're trying to do. From the work groups, you see the education workforce, what's been going on within the last 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. I get it mixed up. But we've had several meetings with several entities. 6 weeks? Several meetings with several different entities. I continue to hear the term that we're not opening this up, that we're not being transparent, we're not bringing people from the outside to the table. And I really need to make sure everybody understands that that is definitely not the case. At this point, we've had well over 8 or 9 meetings with different entities, between the sponsorships of charter schools, between individual charter schools, with the collaborative that's made up of multiple charter schools. We have meetings set up to actually meet with the archdiocese to actually be a part of this process, because we know how important this is. We've actually had meetings with the president of the Board of Aldermen, various alder people that really have integral parts of what this actual plan would look like. We did have the opportunity to present last night at the MSB board to actually go over really what this challenge is going to be and what it looks like for the city as a whole. We do have a lot of naysayers, but I really want people to understand this is a work in progress, and we're actually doing it. What you see before you, as I stated, is the breakout of the guiding questions, the key questions that we're going to have. And what you see next to it is the contributors, where we've already had the opportunity to identify who will actually be chairing and co-chairing these particular groups. As we move forward, we're actually going to start setting dates for the breakout groups and when and how they'll look. And we're actually in the process of identifying who will actually be key facilitators of these particular groups, because that's how important it is. But we want to make sure that we have a deep dynamic of contributors that's going to be a part of each one of the groups, where it makes sense. Like if we have on one, you see we have a representative from the union, a representative from St. Louis Public School, a representative from Slate, and a representative from HR of SLPS. So it's kind of just laying out each category and who and will be representing within those categories. We do have a presentation that we have to do, or not have to do, that we've been asked to do, to actually go before the Missouri State School Board Association. Will be presenting, I presented to them on March 28th. We'll be going before the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on April 12th to present and go in detail about what we're doing in regards to the citywide plan, as well as presenting to the Missouri Charter Public School Commission on April the 13th to present to them, to let them know that this is not something that just we're trying to do, but this is going to take everybody to be a part of what this educational citywide plan is actually going to look like. We did have an excellent meeting with one of the charter sponsors, and that person from the charter sponsor actually is willing to be a part of our ad hoc citywide committee, as well as representing one of our work groups. And we've met with, like I stated, some members from the board chairs from the City Garden, as well as the board chairs from Soulard Charter School. So there's a lot of work involved in this, and I definitely want to thank the board for your continued support and what we're trying to do. And I'll take any questions. Before I do that, I'm sorry. I definitely want to give recognition and thank the Ecumenical Leadership Council. They have signed on to be a part of our moratorium that we're working on. We have a letter in support of that, as well as the president of AFT Local 420. They have also signed on to be a part of the citywide committee plan, as well as the moratorium. Am I saying that right? Okay. I'll take any questions if you have them.
I have a question.
Yes.
Will there be an opportunity for parents, caregivers, and community members to be involved?
Yes, sir, Mr. Matt. I'm so glad you've asked that question. We actually had meetings with parent representation, and yes, they will be involved. What we're doing and what you're going to start seeing is when the work groups start, like the notice of work groups are starting to happen, that's going to be open to all. We're especially wanting the parents and the students engaged at the table when we're having those discussions. So yes, and we actually have looked to see, it's not just that, that's very important, but we haven't brought the St. Louis Police Department to be a part of this, especially when we're talking about community and safety. That's why we're looking at Slate. That's why we're looking at WashU representatives, Athenia, BJC, the medical field. So we're trying to make sure we're covering all of those areas, but definitely we want their voices at the table.
I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing, because it's the citywide plan and it's something that we've needed for a long time. So I appreciate your leadership, and it's really difficult to be transparent with all of this stuff and make it accessible to everybody that you can. So I think you're doing a great job with what we've got so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Co-Chair. I do want to reiterate what you said at the very beginning, that this is a very inclusive process. Everyone is at the table. To include, what we're doing is guiding the process, but we've reached out to charters, independent, and to the Archdiocese, as our chairperson has said. And so when you hear something that's contrary to that, know that we are very transparent and clear that this is a very inclusive process.
And all of these meetings that are available to the public, they're listed on our SLPS website, are they not?
Yes, they're
So-
listed on the website, as well as the citywide plan. We
It
have a
has its
website
own
with
section,
detailed
yeah.
information. Yes, ma'am.
So anybody who wants it, the information, it is definitely out there.
Open
Pretty
to the
easy to
public.
find.
Yes.
I have a question. Are any of these on Zoom, the meetings that you'll be holding?
They will, we're gonna do the blended or the hybrid part where it'll actually be on Zoom, but open to the public as well. So we'll make sure that is set up where if you can't make it in person, that it'll actually be Zoom accessible.
Thank you so much. Listed on the agenda are 3 items: the board norms and the board self-evaluation, along with the April board officers election. Can you imagine that we've been together a year coming in April? And so I just want you to refer to the board norms, the board self-evaluation, and have in mind that we'll move into the board officer elections in April as well. Are there any other
Is there a,
comments?
so do you want to do the board self-evaluation or a time frame you want us to do it, or a mechanism? I know we talked about it in the governance committee a while ago, a long while ago.
We are we have so much to do, and so I haven't set a time frame at this date, but I'm hoping that, and I'm recommending that when you receive the doodle poll, as we come together to kind of chat about the CPN, that we'll be prepared to do that at that time.
Okay.
Any other comments? With that, we are set to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Ms. Sonier,
Yes.
Ms. Cousins,
Yes.
Ms. Fowl,
Yes.
Mr. Davis.